Hello there. What I'm trying to do, and I spent my 2 years as president of the IPA in the UK trying to do, is to re-inject or recreate links between advertising, marketing, and academia that seemed to exist in the 50s and 60s, and which, for whatever reason, atrophied completely. Now, there's fault on both sides for this, I think, which is that the advertising industry, once it had a model which justified the use of widespread television, made so much money from the activity that it wasn't really incentivized to look elsewhere for inspiration into human behavior. So long as your model, broadly speaking, justified your most profitable activity, there wasn't much reason to ask. You could also, and I only learned this about a month or two ago from a very interesting academic, you could also say that psychology took a wrong turn as well, which was psychology became absolutely preoccupied with the mind as an entity, whereas Darwinian psychology and the latest expertise in the social sciences tends to agree now that the mind has evolved to make decisions according to context and the specific environmental situation. It's a choice-making, decision-making entity, and actually psychology, by focusing immensely on models of the mind that actually completely ignored the environment in which the mind finds itself, and by, I suppose, getting completely obsessed with questions of not much interest to marketers like whether or not you fancy your own mum, psychology probably took a wrong turn as well. But what interests me is that if you look back at David Ogilvy and Bill Bernbach, both of them, to a great degree, were actually wannabe social scientists. And I suppose my instinct now is to try and introduce someone. Ogilvy himself actually wanted to move the agency from Manhattan to Princeton, because having worked at Gallup, he liked the academic environment that you found in Princeton. It was his probably saner colleagues who prevented him from making this move. What I've now discovered is that actually in the last 10 or so years in the social sciences, progress made in understanding the mind and understanding the way in which we actually decide has been remarkably great. And it's the kind of progress that's of interest to us, whether you're a social marketer, a conventional marketer, in advertising or anything else. Probably the single most significant moment in this was when Daniel Kahneman, author of a recent bestseller called Thinking Fast and Slow, was awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2002. What was interesting about this is Kahneman, for the first time, was awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics while not being an economist. He's actually a psychologist. And his work focused, and focuses still, on how actual human decision-making differs from the decision-making posited by the perfectly efficient market hypothesis, by the assumptions of neoclassical economics, that we make decisions consciously, rationally, and basically according to sort of mathematical models of perfection. Kahneman makes very clear, as other people have before him, that the mind is effectively like an Intel duo-core processor. It contains two parts. Jonathan Haidt, a very good writer, and again another American writer on this, has written extensively with a beautiful analogy which says that the human mind works a little like a rider and an elephant. The human rider is rational. He can respond to rational arguments. He can have long-term aims. He can make long-term plans as to where he wants the elephant to go. But ultimately, the elephant's more powerful. If the elephant doesn't want to go where he wants it to go, there's nothing he can do in the world to make it go there. And I think this analogy of the elephant and the rider is a very, very useful one in understanding the mind, because the problem is that the rider is delusional. When the elephant goes in the wrong direction, the rider's very prone to actually post-rationalize and say, well, this is where I wanted to go anyway. The elephant is just doing what I told him to do. The rider is also spectacularly indecisive, that without the elephant's impetus, it will actually just go round and round in intellectual circles, comparing more and more variables and possible routes without actually going anywhere at all. So the interesting question we have to ask in marketing is, have we, when we market, which is not to say that everything we've done in marketing is wrong, but the fundamental question is we've asked marketing to become more effective and more accountable without actually asking how it works and why it works. And our reasoning may in fact be completely wrong. We think, for example, that we're talking to the rider. It may well be that advertising works because it appeals to the elephant. We haven't actually understood the distinction between the two, and we haven't understood the interrelationship between what Kahneman calls the system one brain, or elephant, which is far, far more ancient, much quicker, extraordinarily frugal, and not at all lazy. That's the instinctive brain that doesn't give you a headache when you use it. Then there's the system two brain, the rider, which can make long-term plans, it can do mathematics, it can construct rational models of the world, but ultimately it doesn't make the decisions. It exercises at the most a small influence on the direction of travel. Another beautiful analogy used is that the system two brain, the rider, thinks it's the Oval Office, when in reality it's the press office. In truth, most of our rationalizations are actually post-rationalizations. That actually what they are is we construct a narrative around events that have actually been decided elsewhere. We're not actually making decisions and forming strategy in our lives most of the time. We're actually reacting in a sense like a press office does, which is desperately trying to construct a plausible and rational seeming narrative which makes sense of actions that have actually already been initiated somewhere else. So the press office, not the Oval Office. And yet we spend all our time, I would argue, there's a huge bias in research and a massive bias within the structure of business to construct conversations that appeal to the rider and not the elephant. We're hence talking to the press office and not actually to the Oval Office of human decision making. What we're doing in many cases, this is not to say that what we do doesn't work. It may simply be working for reasons completely different to the reasons we've posited. So the point to remember here is that actually we may, much of our time, be talking to the wrong people, talking in language which the rider can understand but the elephant can't, and in effect writing software for the wrong operating system. Now, if this is true, what it doesn't mean is that we have to actually completely invalidate everything we've done, because quite a lot of what we do patently works. It's simply that if we want to make what we do more effective, we have to ask ourselves not how can we make this more effective in its own terms according to a pre-existing model. We actually have to ask, why is this working? Now, marketing, I think, has become far too subordinate to finance. One of the phrases used of marketing is we must become more accountable. I think this is a pathetic lack of ambition. To be accountable basically means you spend every year justifying your activities in the most pathetic terms, going, we didn't waste all the money honestly, please can I keep my job? I don't want to be accountable. Now, I think marketing needs to be more measurable. It also needs to be much more testable. But that's a completely different question. Accountability is the wrong thing. Because in truth, given the complexity of the elephant, and the fact that the elephant is not a rational entity, we may never be able to construct perfect predictive models of what will actually change human behavior. And so the idea that actually the way to make marketing more effective is to reduce wastage may be completely wrong. The way to improve marketing may be actually to experiment very intelligently with a certain proportion of the budget and simply find out what works. It's still science, it's just a different kind of science. And the problem we have is that most businesses, most client businesses, have become exclusively system two in their operation. That's not to say that instinct or the elephant can play no role, but every single decision is decided in business on the ease of explaining it in rational terms. If you arrive at a decision by rational terms in a business, you will never get fired. No one ever got fired for being too rational. It's very easy to be fired for being irrational. It's very hard to be fired for being unimaginative. So the bias between the two systems of the brain concerns me in business, because what you have is a massive asymmetry where when making decisions, people are really as much interested in how easily the decision can be defended in rational terms to other people as they are in the long-term likelihood of effectiveness of that decision. And there's an argument that business decision-making has been crippled by the fact that actually, if you look at business activity, probably the greater part of it is actually defensive and justificatory rather than actually exploratory. Now, you have this fundamental disconnect, which is that what we need to be as marketers is not taking dictation, being accountable, simply following a business strategy which is decided by people looking at a spreadsheet and then executing it in pieces of communication. It has to be a two-way street. Because if the business world doesn't understand the elephant, what it's actually doing, again, is developing products, developing propositions, designing a whole business that appeals to the intelligent but remarkably ineffectual rider and actually ignores the elephant completely. It's very, very interesting to look at the spectacular success of organizations that are often led by a founder. I'd attribute my own organization to one of those, David Ogilvy, Apple being an obvious other one. The great advantage a founder enjoys is that actually he's allowed to be system one. The power and respect he enjoys with an organization means that people effectively trust his instincts. And that makes founder-driven organizations, the organizations that don't necessarily have to spend their whole time justifying themselves to the system two people on Wall Street, intrinsically more interesting. That what's actually happening is that the need to justify everything using rider language, not elephant language, actually seems to me a significant burden on business effectiveness. Let me give an example of a case. As well as people like Jobs, Ogilvy, Branson, etc., there were another two groups of people who were allowed to make irrational but effective interventions. Now, in order to understand this, I know this is a very difficult thing to understand, but in most of the real world, I don't mean in physics, okay? I don't mean when calculating the surface area of a cone. I'm not referring to areas which actually submit themselves to perfect mathematical models or exact mathematical calculation. But in most of real life, rationality is not the same as intelligence. We've come to conflate the two. We think that a rational solution must be the most intelligent solution. I would dispute this. I would say that in real life, in anything that involves complex systems, whether it be meteorology, economics, human psychology, in particular mass human psychology, which are inherently complex systems, there is no rational answer. Moreover, rationality will usually not get you to the best answer. Okay, at the end of a game of chess, if there's a possibility of checkmate, that is inarguably a rational move. There is no rational reason why you should not wish to put someone into checkmate when the possibility exists to do so. In most of a game of chess, there is no, if you define rationality as believing there is a single provable and optimal move, mathematically provable to be better than any other move, in most of the course of a game of chess, that simply isn't true. In order to know what the single best move would be, you would not only have to know every other possible move that your opponent might make, you would actually have to know the entire workings of your opponent's brain. There simply isn't a right answer. And this is true of most decisions in the real world which involve real people or any other kind of complex system. Now, here's an example. Frederick the Great wanted the Germans. Now, what I was saying is that there were two entities. Now, I realize I'm talking to an American audience, so I've got to be careful here. But there was a strength to both royalty and to religion. And one of the great strengths that royalty and religion had is you could posit solutions to things which were sometimes highly intelligent without needing to justify them in rational terms. I'll give you one example here. Frederick the Great wanted the Germans to be less dependent on grain for their food, the Prussians to be precise. He realized that if you only had one source of carbohydrate in the diet, a famine or a very bad harvest caused bread prices to rocket massively. There was no other food that could actually substitute at an equivalent calorific level. This therefore caused bread prices to go up, the danger of famine, and of course the danger of civil unrest, which emperors generally don't like. So he decided if you could actually dual source the Prussian diet so that there was a substitute for grain in years when the grain harvest, what we call wheat, you call wheat, we call corn sometimes. You call maize corn, don't you? He realized that actually if you could get people to grow potatoes alongside wheat, then the volatility of the food supply would be massively reduced, since the chance that both crops failed was much, much lower than the chance that one crop failed. So far, so rational, very rational idea. And then he tried legislating, forcing Prussians to grow potatoes, and they resisted. Some people were arrested to refuse to grow the potato. What you have to remember is they hadn't then invented the chip. The thing was a foreign, strange import. It looks decidedly unattractive, and having an emperor tell you you really ought to grow this stuff, peasant, isn't the most effective form of persuasion. People were arrested for refusing the edict. He tried financial incentives. They also failed. So the two rational solutions, compulsion and financial incentive, both failed. So he tried talking to the elephant. What Frederick the Great did and was able to do was he talked to the elephant. And he said, what I want you to do, he then declared that the potato was a royal vegetable, that only members of the royal family were allowed to eat it, and that he planted a potato crop outside the palace with instructions that the royal potato patch should be guarded night and day, but with secret instructions to the guards not to guard it very well. Now, the elephant operates through heuristics, not through logic. Heuristics are great, but they're a fundamentally different sort of punch card to the punch card you program the logical brain with. And two very powerful heuristics are, one, if somebody tells me I can't have something because I'm not worth it, okay, I really want that thing, okay? Secondly, scarcity value, rarity value, has an enormous emotional effect on us. It's a bias that's almost universal to nearly all cultures. That's why things like caviar, which taste disgusting, are still highly prized. Anything that's rare intrinsically is appealing to people. Within a few months of this plan, people were going around Prussia with pilfered potatoes from the royal potato plot, just as he intended, going, does anybody want to buy a tuber? That's a case of talking to the elephant. Now, when you talk to the elephant, rationality won't tell you how to talk to the elephant. The elephant doesn't necessarily respond to rational economic incentives. The elephant is not Milton Friedman, okay? The second thing is only a degree of creativity or instinct will get you to the best solution. If we just move on one. Now, Hayek, great Austrian economist, made the very good point that economics has made a fundamental mistake, and I think business is now this is 1973, Hayek said this. I think that 40 years later, I think that business is making exactly the same mistake. It's trying to apply the laws of the physical sciences to things where those laws simply don't apply. It's trying to construct Newtonian, mechanistic, mathematical models to actually define human behavior. Now, that's very dubious when you're dealing with individual human behavior. Once you accept the fact that each individual behavior affects the behavior of others, it's patently clear that Newtonian models don't work. And yet, he criticized economics for doing this in 1972, 40 years ago. He calls it scientism. It's decidedly unscientific in the true sense of the word, since it involves a mechanical and uncritical application of habits of thoughts to fields different from those in which they've been formed. Here's Nicholas Nassim Taleb on the next slide. Sorry, I'll skip this one very quickly. This is Taleb making the same point, that actually the number of things that can be defined and explained by mathematical models is quite small. Real life questions, who should I marry, okay? The really important questions in real life don't really submit themselves to mathematical analysis. Which house should I buy? Who should I get married to? What should I eat? And another point from Hayek, in the physical sciences, the things that really matter, air pressure, temperature, you know, things in the first and second law of thermodynamics, are also numerically expressible and measurable. In real-world behavior, what really matters may be much, much less numerically expressible than something that's unimportant. And yet business, with its love of spreadsheet-driven decision-making, will always latch on to what's numerically expressible, not what's really important. It has an inherent bias towards numbers. And that's the fundamental problem, which is the brain isn't like that. Karl Popper said that things in the world exist on a spectrum between clocks and clouds. Things that are mechanistic and actually can be described in mathematical terms, and things that are closer to meteorology or psychology. He went on to say the worst mistakes in human decision-making are always made by people, and I think he possibly meant communists in this case, but it applies actually to the worst excesses of shareholder-driven capitalism, trying to treat cloud-like things as if they were clocks, trying to actually devise Newtonian mathematical models for things which simply aren't that kind of thing. Now, the human brain, most of the system 1 brain, the elephant, if you want to call it that, hasn't evolved to work numerically or mathematically. In fact, there's some evidence that shows that in primitive tribes that don't have a system of numbering, the instinct of counting works logarithmically, not in a linear way. Most people in the West, if you give them a pile with 1 seed of grain and 9 seeds of grain and ask them to construct a pile in the middle, they'll put 5 down. If you go to tribes that haven't invented counting, they actually put 3 pieces of grain down. So it seems that our instincts, our mathematical instincts, are somehow weirdly logarithmic and not linear in any case. But the way the human brain works, and I'll go back to this very quickly, the system, if I can just go back a few, very, very quickly, to the picture with the ball. The way the human brain works, mostly, is through heuristics. How many people are familiar with the word? It is, I would argue, the most important word you can introduce in marketing today. If we could get most marketers to understand the word heuristic, we would make an enormous amount of progress, which is to understand that people make decisions through rules of thumb according to a specific context. This is how you catch a ball. Luckily, I'm talking to Americans here who understand baseball, if not cricket. I'm often talking to Europeans who don't really have a sport where you catch balls in the same way. The way it works is cricketers and baseball players in the outfield do not perform quadratic equations to work out where a ball's going to land. They don't calculate for air resistance. They deploy a heuristic. They look up at the ball, calculate the angle of gaze, and move towards the ball at whatever speed keeps that angle of gaze constant. It's incredibly fast. It's cognitively very easy. 2 very interesting things about it. 1, it doesn't involve conscious thought at all. Cricketers and baseball players aren't aware that's how they catch a ball. The only way you can find this out is through observation. So important implications for the research industry here. Not all our heuristics operate with our own awareness. We can't necessarily describe our own heuristics. Secondly, the heuristic obviously predates actually humanity, since experiments with dogs have shown they use exactly the same heuristic to catch frisbees. It may be this heuristic is learned, it may be it's innate. What is interesting is it operates below our level of consciousness. And we have thousands and thousands of these things, millions of these heuristics which we deploy. If we can understand heuristics better, we start to understand the elephant as well as just the rider. The second point to realize is these heuristics, I said that rationality is not necessarily intelligence. These are not necessarily a poor substitute for mathematical logic. I would argue that most people heuristically predicted the financial crash of 2008. Very, very few people predicted it in the way that Rubini did, by having mathematical explanations of why there was going to be a crash. Most people instinctively thought something was wrong. How many of you thought in 2007 there was something a bit wrong with the financial sector? Just instinctively, without being able to put a spreadsheet to it. About 1 in, yeah, I mean, probably about half. The reason is quite likely you are probably using a very, very reliable heuristic, by the way, which we use all the time, which is simply, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. Now, if you had used that heuristic in the financial sector, rather than using complex mathematical models, they would have been actually better off. All of you would use that heuristic. If you went out of this hotel today and there was a bloke trying to sell you a fur coat for $50 or whatever, none of you would buy it, in defiance of rational economic theory. The reason is that, that overriding the rational urge to buy something worth $20,000 for $50 is the basic feeling that actually something here is too good to be true. The elephant, in many cases, is actually not more rational, but more intelligent than the rider. Do you all agree with, I mean, does anybody disagree with this? By all means, there are huge books you can read by a guy called Gerd Gigerenzer, where he actually mathematically proves that decisions we arrive at using heuristics can be better than those we arrive at using rational mathematical models. But it drives statisticians and data analysts practically insane. Any data analyst in the room? The book is called, I think it's called Simple Heuristics That Make Us Smart by Gerd Gigerenzer. And actually every statistician or data analyst should actually read the book. Now, let me explain how religion and royalty enjoy a slight advantage in that they can actually... It was royalty that got the practice of variolation, which was a forerunner of vaccination, established in Britain. Extraordinary valuable medical innovation. How did they do it? They simply gave variolation to their own children. In Britain, there was a very common heuristic in the, I imagine it was the sort of 18th century, early 18th century. If it's good enough for the royal family, it's good enough for me. Okay? You slightly abandoned that towards the end of the 18th century, I noticed. But interestingly, they used, effectively, they talked to the elephant. And religion talks to the elephant. Here's an example. If you want to restrict people's alcohol intake, what do? The conventional thing is you go to a scientist who comes up with a rational answer. He says people who consume below this amount of alcohol in a week generally don't come to any harm through it. So we will make a recommendation of 28 units a week, as they do in the UK, as a safe alcohol consumption limit for males. That is rational. No one will lose their job as a health advisor for making that recommendation, because it's been arrived at through sequential logic, and the guy's job is safe. It isn't, however, the most intelligent suggestion you can make. We would argue that the most intelligent thing to tell people is, whatever you do, make sure you don't drink on 2 or 3 days a week. That is less rational. It's actually irrational, because theoretically you could obey that instruction and be a raging alcoholic on the other 4 days. It's, however, much more helpful in controlling the elephant. Why? The elephant is much stronger at dealing with binary instructions rather than instructions of degree. Asking humans to practice continual self-restraint by counting units and by involving continual mathematical effort is much more tiring as a form of self-restraint than absolute instructions. There are a few other reasons why 2 days a week or 3 days a week are better. It can be socially reinforcing. You and your friends can all agree not to drink on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and actually the whole thing then becomes socially self-reinforcing. A unit's recommendation doesn't. It's easy to police your wife, husband, boyfriend, girlfriend. You can say, now remember, if you drink today, you can't drink tomorrow. Now, unless your girlfriend works for the East German secret police, or used to work for the Stasi, you're not really going to accept a partner in a romantic relationship going, now how many units did you have today? Right, you can only have 2.3 units tomorrow, okay? That involves a degree of what you might call intrusion and a degree of policing, which is actually slightly offensive and annoying. Whereas saying, don't forget, if you drink today, you can't drink tomorrow, and I'm going to do the same thing as you do, is both reinforcing and easy to keep to. And we were trying to argue this case, and we realized there was a 3,000-year-old precedent, which is God. God is a very good behavioral economist. Religion talks to the elephant brilliantly intelligently. Jewish dietary law is fantastic, okay? Now, if you went to the modern European Union and you said, we think pigs are unclean, they'd issue an 80,000-word directive on pig husbandry and hygiene, which no one would read, and half the countries in the European Union would ignore completely. Jewish dietary restriction just said, no pigs. Okay? That is a much better solution to the problem. It's also easier to police. You can't actually spot whether your neighbor is actually obeying the 80,000-word directive, but it's pretty difficult for your neighbor to keep pigs without you knowing about it. Okay? Jewish dietary law is also incredibly intelligent because you may need to know whether I can eat a fish or not when you're actually 4 miles out at sea and there isn't a rabbi to hand. So the instructions, apparently arbitrary, are psychologically very intelligent. And we need to have a whole debate about this, because actually, is there a problem that if you have a decline in religion and a decline in royal families, that actually who can issue the new heuristics? Who can construct the positive beneficial habits? Now, what God did, you'll notice, is when he wanted a working time directive, he didn't do what they did in France and say, you can only work 35 hours a week. He said, on the 7th day, you rest. The Sabbath is talking to the elephant. The 35-hour week is talking to the rider. I think this is an incredibly important distinction. This, by the way, is the first neoclassical economist, Procrustes in ancient Greek mythology, who was a man who had a bed. And if his guests were too tall for the bed, he'd chop their feet off. And if they were too short, he'd stretch them on a rack so that they fitted. This is what, to some extent, classical economics, and to some extent what your finance department does. It has a convenient numerical model of its own, and it then develops models. It strips everything that makes us human out of the model in order to make it work mathematically. It solves the model and then imposes the solution on the very people for whom it was intended. What Procrustes should have done is actually developed a flexible bed. He didn't. He tried to make people fit the model rather than making the model fit people. And what this has led to is a thing called the arithmocracy, where in business today, people who have a spreadsheet, who have a number or a mathematical model, automatically wield power over everybody who doesn't. I've been a non-executive director in a few organizations. Trust me, you sit there basically for 2 hours in the board meeting and 96% of the conversation is entirely about looking at the balance sheet and a few bogus numerical proxy metrics. If you use an abstract noun, it's as if you've just farted. Okay? And the business has actually become almost, Asperger's Inc. It's acquired very, very good numerical skills at the expense of any kind of human understanding because it simply demands that everything be numerically expressed before it can be respected as a measure. Weirdly, Hayek, who is a much better economist than your finance director is, let's be honest about it, okay, spotted this problem 40 years ago. The second problem you have is the double standard, the asymmetry. If you have a creative idea, I know this, I've worked as a copywriter for years, you have to have it policed by lots of rational people. The same does not apply the other way around. Rational people come up with a model, solve the problem, they go, it's going to be A. They don't say, but before I recommend it, I'm going to show it to some really silly people first to see if they can come up with a wacky different idea. So creativity is heavily policed by rationality, as it probably should be, but the same does not apply the other way around. Here's a case in point of what I would call arithmocracy at its worst. £6 billion spent reducing the journey time by building a new railway line between the coast of the UK and London to reduce the journey time from Paris from 3.5 hours to about 2 hours 55. If you play Angry Birds, the innovation is completely irrelevant since time has no meaning if you're playing Angry Birds. I would also argue what this is all driven by is the fact that duration and speed are expressible in numerical terms, whereas how enjoyable your journey is, isn't. So journey enjoyment isn't actually very numerically expressible. How comfortable your seat is, there isn't actually a linear model for that. Now, don't get me wrong, if you can get a journey down from 8 hours to 4.5 or 3, high-speed rail makes a lot of sense. It may make sense between San Francisco and Los Angeles in the future, for example. Someone did tell me that the trouble with the high-speed, is it the Acela link you have here? Is it so fast that it makes it too bumpy to type on? Is this true? But actually, for a tiny fraction of that money, they could have put Wi-Fi on the trains. 10 years later, there is still no Wi-Fi on those trains. That would make far more difference to the productivity and the enjoyment of the journey. If you liked, you could take £1 billion out of the 6, hire all of the world's top male and female supermodels, get them to walk up and down the train handing out free Chateau Petrus to all the passengers. You'd still have £5 billion left in change, and people would ask for the train to be slowed down. But no one was ever asked to posit those alternatives because the whole thing had to be justified by an arithmocracy in numerical terms. This is a beautiful solution, the opposite. The single best thing on the London Underground they did to improve passenger satisfaction per pound spent didn't involve a single bit of engineering equipment, didn't make the trains faster, more frequent, more regular, didn't make them run any later. It was dot matrix display boards on the platforms. That is a psych hack, as people in the software industry call it. It's something that exploits the understanding of the elephant, not the understanding of the rider. Why? Because what's annoying about a wait for a train isn't so much the duration, it's the degree of uncertainty. This is what they do in South Korea for traffic lights. Red traffic lights count down towards green. It reduces accidents. Road rage, impatience, jumping the lights is all much less common. In China, they took it to a silly extreme and did that with green traffic lights as well, which isn't a good idea, trust me. If you're 200 yards out and you realize you've got 5 seconds left, you floor it. The Koreans tested both. It increases the accident rate when you do it with green lights, but on red lights, it has a beneficial effect. I think there are tons of solutions. How many people here? Anybody from Minnesota? Now, I talked about royalty. This is what happens when you have a governor who's a professional wrestler, not a professional politician. I think you can start doing really imaginative different things. The zipper merge is a heuristic which is taught. When 2 lanes of traffic go down to 1, you go all the way to the front using all the available road, and then you join 1 car at a time, like a zipper. It reduces the length of the delay, it reduces the tailback so it doesn't start blocking previous junctions, it reduces the accident rate, and it reduces the speed through the interchange. It's very important because a lot of people hate late mergers. Do you have the phrase late merging? It's the kind of thing Larry David would get livid about. You know, someone basically cutting up on the left-hand lane and then cutting in at the last moment. What happens is people resent those late mergers to such an extent, they then close ranks in the right-hand lane, refusing to let people in, and what should be an orderly process actually becomes rivalrous. It's particularly important this because it's very difficult to get the British to late merge. Because if you're British, queue jumping is somewhere there on a par with paedophilia in the list of things you really shouldn't do. Okay? I'd like to introduce this to the UK. I think it's a brilliant thing. Interestingly, it's not quite rational. In a rational world, you'd get the cars to go 10 at a time. But 1 at a time is much cognitively easier than having 10 cars go and then 10 from the other lane, because no one will mess it up, miscount, and cause a crash. And also, you couldn't call it the zipper merge then, which is a fantastic... The Dutch have done the same thing. They've called it whatever the Dutch for zipper is. I think there are tons of solutions to the world's problems we can enjoy by learning to talk to the elephant. This is my idea for getting people to finish their course of antibiotics. Don't give them 24 white pills. Give them 18 white pills and 6 blue ones, and say, when you finish the white pills, take the blue ones. If any course of action has a milestone in it, the elephant is much more likely to complete the thing. It's breadcrumbs. You know that business, Hansel and Gretel or whatever it is? Yeah, where you drop the breadcrumbs. If you drop breadcrumbs, little things in the middle of a course of action, the software loading bar is another example. With a loading bar, we'll wait 8 minutes for software to download. Without the loading bar, we give up after 5 seconds. We need a marker of progress. That's the solution. 18 white pills, 6 blue ones, and you tell people, finish the white ones first, and then you finish the blue ones. But you need creativity to do this. You won't arrive at these solutions through rational means. Can anybody read that? Sorry. It's simply a mathematical formula. In the middle it says, then a miracle occurs. And it says, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. But that, to some extent, is how the creative process works. There isn't a way of getting through sequential logic from one place to the other. Now, understanding the elephant, diets. Asking people to lose weight by continual calorie restriction is a bit like asking people to give up sex by going to lap dancing clubs instead. Taleb, the great philosopher, says it's easier to fast than to diet. There's no mention of dieting in the Bible. You don't get Moses went into the desert and he went on a low-carb diet for 5 days. What they do in religion is you fast. Why? Because the elephant finds binary decisions much easier to make than decisions of degree. Now, I don't look as if I'm qualified to speak on this, but you should have seen me 2 months ago. Atkins. The Atkins diet may not work because it's a brilliant diet. It may work because the elephant likes it. Basically, it says, don't eat these things, eat quite a lot of those. And most men who basically, if you tell them they can eat bacon and eggs, are basically content with any diet. That's an acceptable trade-off. But this is dieting by heuristic, not dieting by rationality. It's a rule of thumb. Don't eat these things, eat more of those. That's easy to do. Eat what you eat already, but a bit less of it every time you have a meal is a really, really difficult thing to do. The rider believes it's the right way to do it. The elephant just can't. Now, very, very quickly, I've only got 3 or 4 minutes left, and I'll run through this very quickly. A few lessons about talking to the elephant. Relativity. All our perception is relative, not absolute. If you look at the 2 squares A and B, A looks darker to all of you, doesn't it? In reality, if I change the context, they're actually exactly the same color. Now, it's not one of those optical illusions where you go, oh, silly me, now I see it, I was deceived. If I go back to the original, it's now impossible for you to see that in any way other than A being. All our perception, pain, value, price, temperature, pitch, with a single exception of people who have perfect pitch, by the way, nearly all our perception is actually relative, not absolute. And that applies to value as well. I made the point that perception is relative. This is actually a plaque in London. Benedict Arnold, American Patriot. Just to show that actually how things are depends on from which angle you see them. Now, Marks & Spencer's very expensive food entity in the UK. It can't compete with ordinary restaurants. It doesn't. It changes the frame of reference, so it competes with restaurants, with dining out. Dine in for 2 for £10. That's a framing effect. If you compare Marks & Spencer's with Asda or with Walmart, it seems very, very expensive. If you compare it with going out for a meal, it's actually very cheap. Our perception here can be changed. Nespresso enjoys a brilliant profit margin because although it's an incredibly expensive way of consuming coffee, if you had to buy a jar of Folgers to feed your Nespresso machine, as it were, something in a jar, with the equivalent caffeine content, it'd be like paying about $90 or $100 for a jar of coffee. And we couldn't bring ourselves to do that because an ordinary jar of coffee costs 5 or 6. But brilliantly, it doesn't come in a jar, it comes in little pods. And our only frame of reference when we put a pod in isn't Folgers, it's Starbucks. And we go, well, 35 cents for a coffee, that would have cost me $2 in Starbucks. The machine's practically paying for itself. Our perception of nearly everything is relative, not absolute. This is an example I'll skip for reasons of time. Signaling, Darwinian signaling. A huge amount of the elephant's time is looking for signals, not messages. The elephant isn't very interested in what your advertising says, the rational argument your advertising contains about why your product is better. What the elephant is impressed by is the fact that you're advertising at all, because it's an upfront expenditure which suggests a long-term commitment. In game theory, if you were planning to sell a load of dodgy televisions quickly and then disappear, you wouldn't advertise. You only advertise when you're planning to engage in long-term value exchange activity with the customer. The elephant is brilliant at detecting untrustworthy behavior, and advertising reassures it. The engagement ring is a form of advertising. Men genetically can have asymmetric mating strategies. The mating equilibrium between men and women is slightly different. And it is more genetically advantageous for men, shall we say, not to commit. Okay? Therefore, an engagement ring, by being upfront and expensive, is a gesture of long-term commitment because it's an upfront expense only recoverable over time, a bit like Amazon Prime for women, effectively. No, but it's an upfront expense recoverable over time is proof of long-term commitment. Advertising does that. It's an upfront expense recoverable over time. An engagement ring is the same thing. That's a very expensive way of getting a one-night stand, symbolically, I'm saying. An awful lot of this stuff is actually, what does this actually say about the person who's saying it, not what it says. Very interesting thing, women particularly like being given flowers and jewelry by men, and the theory in Darwinian psychology is precisely because men aren't remotely interested in flowers and jewelry. So when you buy a woman flowers or jewelry, you're making a genuine sacrifice because you care about her happiness, not yours. It's a true sacrifice, flowers, jewelry. If you buy your wife for her birthday a radio-controlled helicopter, she'll always suspect a degree of self-interest behind the purchase. So understanding that things have a meaning to the elephant that is nothing to do with what the rider thinks their meaning is. The bowerbird constructs a nest, and that has a meaning. Likeability. A huge amount of our brains has evolved to detect deception in other people. I once refused to buy a house because I didn't like the person selling it to me. He refused to make a basic gesture, which is I'd agreed the fridge was included in the purchase price. He then backtracked on it, and then when I said, well, I'll pay for the fridge, although the fridge was 3 years old, he wanted the new replacement cost of the fridge. And I said to my wife, this man is a shit. He worked in financial services, funnily enough. I said, if anything funny happens, I'm walking away. Something else funny happened, we walked away. This was totally irrational. My father went crazy. He said, this is a house, it's a 6-figure purchase, you're going to be living there for 10 years, and you're not buying it because you don't like the man. Irrational, very, very intelligent. It later turned out he'd moved all the boundary posts, and most of his garden didn't belong to him. So my instincts were utterly fantastic. Now, I couldn't put those on a spreadsheet. If I'd had to justify that decision to anybody else in business, I couldn't justify that. And yet I was still right. There's interesting evidence from Jeffrey Miller, professor at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, that 1 or 2% of men are basically sociopaths. They're psychopaths. And women have evolved a lot of behaviors unconsciously to detect it, because you don't want to end up married to one. Okay? Far fewer women are sociopaths than men. Slightly more sociopaths, he tells me, in the United States than in Europe, because of selective migration, which is if you're a bit of a sociopath, you know, you didn't really like these people anyway, so I might as well get on a boat. Only kidding. That's true, actually, statistically. But one of the reasons women turn up late, 10 minutes late for a date, is actually to detect, it's an early warning system. Because one thing a sociopath or psychopath may do is totally lose his temper. Most normal blokes will go, I know, traffic's terrible, isn't it? I quite understand. But our elephant brain is making these decisions. What that means, actually, is that men should just know that, you know, when women do these things that are slightly annoying, okay, it's actually a product of 3 million years of evolution, and it's incredibly intelligent. Okay? Turning up slightly late
most normal men will actually respond to that okay. It's a fairly good chance a sociopath will lose his rag completely. It's a very, very clever thing. And our elephant brains are engaged in this kind of play all the time, but we aren't even consciously aware of why we're turning up late. That's the really interesting thing. It's actually a primal urge which goes back much, much older than our consciousness did. Lexicographical choice. We choose not in the way that procurement departments think we should choose, by having lots of weighted variables and scoring them. We choose lexicographically. How a guppy, a female guppy, decides which male guppy to breed with is not weighted averages. First rule, is one guppy 40% or more larger than the other one? If yes, she breeds with the larger one. It's a very clever, visible sign of genetic health, being much bigger, because you've obviously survived for a reasonable length of time and you're doing okay in the food chain, and you're healthy and still alive. So it uses size as the first proxy for genetic health. If one guppy is not 40% bigger, it moves on to the second heuristic, which is they're very attracted to orange pigmentation, a bit like the people of New Jersey, I imagine. And God, I'm on dangerous ground here. So if one of them is significantly more orange than the other, it's had a spray tan or it's just very orange, the guppy breeds with a more orange one. Orangeness you can fake, but you probably have to be a healthy guppy in order to be orange. It's something, like all forms of signaling, it's meaningful because it's expensive, costly, or difficult to do. That's why advertising is a very meaningful form of signaling. What it says is this person is not only communicating it, they're doing it in a way that is costly, or in the case of creative advertising, difficult. And our elephant brain is vastly more attracted by costly forms of signaling, things that are difficult or expensive or time-consuming to do, than it is by the content of the message itself. All of you subconsciously, if you're invited to 2 weddings on the same weekend, and one of them came on a piece of card in a beautiful envelope, and the other invitation came by email, I think I know which wedding you'd go to. The actual content of the message is identical. The degree of cost in the preparation of the message is what actually convinces you there's liable to be a decent free bar at one wedding and not at the other. This is how we choose in nearly everything. The third heuristic is, I won't tell you because it's too smutty to know about, but if you come and talk to me afterwards. But it does this in order. It doesn't do weighted averages. Interestingly, Gigerenzer believes this is a more rational form of decision-making. What consumers do when they choose products is, possibly in some categories, the first heuristic they use is actually brand reputation. That seems totally irrational. I always had doubts about working in advertising, so I said, I know that this brand reputation stuff works, but it's kind of irrational. People shouldn't be deciding like this. They should be deciding by writing everything down and going, how many HDMI ports does it have? How big is the screen? And weighting it all. No, no, no. Brand reputation. If you want to be sure that the television you're buying isn't bad, brand reputation is an incredibly intelligent measure to use. Why? Because it's a brilliant piece of data compression. Fused into brand reputation is a whole variety of things, like how long you've been operating for, how much you advertise, how committed you are to your reputation, and social proof, because reputation also fuses in what other people say about that brand. So as a piece of data compression, choosing by brand reputation is brilliant, particularly when you understand most people don't choose aiming for the rider thinks it's aiming for perfection, because that's what rationality thinks is rationality. One perfect, very best answer. The elephant is much more interested in satisficing, which is buying a television which is probably pretty good, but is definitely not crap. That's ecological rationality. It's a much more sensible way to buy a television. People who buy things using satisficing rather than maximizing tend to be happier in life anyway. But actually, using the brand as a visible correlation for product quality isn't a stupid thing that consumers do. It is spectacularly, unbelievably intelligent. It's just we don't know we're doing it, and we think we shouldn't. Sorry, that's lexicographical choice, just very quickly. I'll skip that. The final thing to know, and this is what makes complex systems like the climate or economies or psychology fundamentally different from simple systems like Newtonian mechanics, disproportionality. There isn't any particular connection between the scale of the intervention and the scale of the effect. Marketers should spend much more time testing very, very small things, because you don't necessarily need to spend $20 million to have a $20 million effect. This difference between the organ donation in different sets of countries is simply whether you make the tick box opt-in or opt-out. It's a $10 typographical change that has a huge effect. This is a page you should Google, the $300 million button. Changing a single word on a button on a checkout page on a website added $300 million in sales the following year. So one of the problems with marketing is self-aggrandizement means that if someone gives us a $20 million budget, we look for $20 million solutions. Maybe we should be looking to redesign the application form as the first thing we ever do. And finally, it's all subjective. It's all relative. I'll skip on to that because I'm running out of time. Very, very quick Diamond Shreddies example. No, I haven't got time for that. This was just a perfect case where actually I'll skip the film, where just changing the way someone looks at something is just as much a source of additional value as changing the thing itself. And again, most people are uncomfortable with that because they think it's irrational. But since we only buy things for the way they make us feel anyway, why should actually decision-making be highly rational? If actually we can look at something in a new way, if we can look at small economical cars and see them as status markers in the way we used to think of big gas-guzzling cars, what's the problem? The final thing, and this is the vital point, in terms of the workings of the elephant, logic won't tell you how the elephant works, and a lot of, not all research, but a lot of research isn't very helpful because you're talking to the rider, not to the elephant. And the rider is busy sitting on top pretending that the elephant doesn't exist and that he controls the elephant completely, which is a glorious self-delusion which probably keeps us sane, but is very, very far from the truth. Finally, if you can note it down, there's a great reading list, a few very, very good books on this subject, but finally a blog post, Farnham Street blog, which is a spectacular way to get a good reading list on this stuff. Your work will never be the same again. And there's one final benefit. Marketing made the mistake of developing the worst possible vocabulary in the world for talking to people who aren't in marketing. It's like the vocabulary of astrology. If you go up to a finance director and talk about brand iconography, it's basically like going to the head of thoracic surgery at St. Mary's Hospital in London and saying, trust to the healing power of the crystal. Marketing language is like the language of astrology because it's fine if you're talking to fellow believers and fellow converts. If you talk to anybody else, I know this because my brother's an astronomer. He's a professional astronomer, and the worst thing that ever happens to him is he meets someone at a party. What do? I'm an astronomer. That's very interesting. I'm a Sagittarius. Okay? But marketing has created a language like that which is absolutely repellent to anybody who isn't in marketing. If you use the language of behavioral economics and you start talking about system 1, system 2, you start talking about hyperbolic discounting, you start talking about path dependency, you'll get your finance director really interested in this. In fact, to your terror, he may turn out to be really rather good at it. Thanks very much indeed.